Well, the other day, a founder came to me and said, should I do it this way? And I said, here's what I do. And they say, okay, I'm going to do it this way. And I say, yes. And then they say, but Will told me to do it this way. And I say, yes. And they go, but this founder told me to do it this way. And I read on the internet this way. And I say, yes. That's a very common occurrence that happens here, because sometimes founders are looking for that silver bullet. They make it black and white, and they get conflicting advice. What's been your experience here?
I say seek out conflicting advice. My biggest concern is when all of a sudden you only hear one answer, because there's almost no problem that I've ever encountered that only has one answer. And every time you seek out advice, and this is one of the things that kills me for the seeker, who's typically less used to doing this, but definitely for the advisor, this is bad form. An advisor's job, if they're good at their job, is to understand and reflect their own bias. So when I give you my advice, here's what I try to caveat it with. Here's why I have this opinion. By the way, your mileage may vary. It almost certainly will. There's no version where the way I handled it could possibly sync exactly to your life and how you should handle it. My job is to give you an option. Your job is to weigh it as the founder.
Here's how I say it. I say, half of my advice is perfect. Like, it is bang on. I'm the most amazing advisor in the world. Yep. I just don't know which half of my advice is going to work for you. So you might as well go get it in different spots and figure out the whole and find out for yourself what works for you, because that way you're going to learn a lot. Just by the exercise of wrestling with all the conflicting views is going to make you a better founder.
Well, what's interesting is when I was earlier in my career, so 30 years ago when I was first starting out, I used to assume that if one person gave me advice, it was gospel. And that's kind of what we're talking about here. What a giant broken assumption that is. There's this guy that used to give me tons of advice, and he had gray hair, right? So I just assumed that he knew. He was Yoda as far as I was concerned. He was Obi-Wan and Yoda combined because he had gray hair. And in retrospect, when I look back at the advice that he was dispensing me, it was terrible. Now, to be fair, he meant well. He's a great guy. He's important at that point in my life. He directed me in some great ways, and I'm thankful. However, he also gave me really bad advice, right? And he didn't even know he was doing it. That was the worst part. But what I did wrong wasn't just follow his advice. I took it as gospel. I took one person's advice as if there's one way to get things done and there's nothing else. And I always think this is hilarious when people are like, hey, successful person, give us your success advice. And I'm like, that is so useless. It worked for them, right? Could have no bearing on how you perform.
I think it gets worse today, Will, because I think founders deify certain figures. You got someone with like 1 million followers on YouTube that just hit this home run, bought Bitcoin at like $300. And now they're dispensing advice on relationships, on your family life, everything, right? But it goes to the reason that I think investors can give some of the shittiest advice on the planet, because they say it with such weight and authority, and you're looking at them saying, I need your money, so everything you tell me, I'm literally going to pivot my startup after I get a rejection from you. One investor told me this advice, and now I have to pivot everything, throw everything out. Man, it's been tough listening to these stories.
It's because as founders, we don't know any better. We just haven't been at the wheel long enough to understand how to synthesize advice. And it's dangerous as hell. So when we get people on Startups.com, we not only give them 2 pieces of conflicting advice or slightly different variants, we also say we intentionally have a different bias and we want you to evaluate those 2. And it frustrates people at first because their answer is, I just want the answer. And we're like, you got to learn. That's not the way this works. There isn't a answer that's always the right answer. There's a handful of answers. And honestly, sometimes all of them will work or none of them will work. But you have to start to learn as a founder how to seek out and synthesize this, because you're going to be getting it from your leadership team. You're going to be getting it from your board. You're going to be getting it from your investors. There's lots of people that will give you lots of different opinions. If you're looking to be blindly led by one person's strong opinion, you're not going to succeed as a founder.
Let me be a little more humble and self-deprecate just a touch more.
Sure.
Because, when I introduce myself, I say, I'm a 7-time funded founder. I've raised venture 7 times. I have 2 exits, but that just means I failed 5 times horribly, right? And not only that, my 2 exits, my first one came during .com 1.0 and then 2.0, and now we're in completely different territory. Things have changed, and that's another context that people have to understand is if you made your heyday in .com 1.0, it's a completely different game. So founders have to step back and say, in my context, historically speaking, yes, human nature repeats itself, which is important, but history doesn't always repeat itself the same way.
Right. And you'll hear people dispense advice with such certainty, being completely clueless and lack so much self-awareness. This drives me insane. To realize that the probability that that same advice is even applicable to the person you're giving it to. I have a crazy idea. Maybe caveat by saying this may not work for you, but here's what worked for me. Imagine that little tidbit of self-awareness where someone would go, oh, you mean this isn't like definitive? This is the only way it works? When I do our pitch deck course, we have this workshop where we talk about how to build a pitch deck. I always open it up with this. What I'm about to show you is an amazing way to build a pitch deck. But fun fact, trillions of dollars have been raised without my help. Right? So that's me just showing some self-awareness. Like, yeah, I've got a great program for you. However, it might not be for you. And it wasn't for a lot of other people, and they did just fine. It doesn't devalue what I'm saying. It just shows that I've got some self-awareness in how I dispense that advice.
I've been in situations right here at Startups.com where I said, all right, listen, I'm going to give you feedback on your pitch deck, but I'm going to ask you some questions first. Are you looking for this type of investor or are you looking for this type of investor? Right. And if they say, I'm looking for investor A, and I say, I speak to investors who are in B pool, who want size of the problem and they want to see the math and all those things, and they want to invest in billion-dollar unicorns. But if you're looking for the visionary investor and you have conviction about your pitch deck and you just want to talk to those types of people, go for it, get feedback. And I'm always presenting options. I'm saying, just as long as you take responsibility for the option you choose.
Right. And I don't think people understand how dramatically different, quote, investors are. They tend to homogenize them into this one category of folks that are, this must represent all investors. The worst part is when investors speak as if they represent all investors. Right. And it's typically an investor who doesn't have a good purview outside themselves, again, lacking some self-awareness, where they're like, well, this is what all investors are going to want. And it's like, oh, cool, you speak for hundreds of thousands of other people. Congratulations. I wasn't aware that you were appointed the opportunity to give all of their opinions at once. And it's just such a, again, I keep coming back to the self-awareness, just a massive lack of self-awareness. If I were an investor, the first thing I would say is, here's the advice I'm giving you. But to be honest, it actually probably doesn't apply to you because the deals that I do and kind of the bias that I have looks like this. However, if anything I'm saying might be useful, by all means use it. I've never heard that coming out of investors' mouth. And if I did, I would kiss them. I would be so overwhelmed by that moment. I don't know what else I would do.
As an investor myself, I've gotten so many opinions wrong. It hasn't been even fair.
How could you not?
Yeah, that's part of the game.
Yeah, it's like anything else. People, when they say, hey, I'm trying to help, I do think everybody's legitimately trying to help. When an investor provides their opinion, an advisor brings their opinion. When you and I bring their opinion, we're trying to help. So I think everyone means well. Where it gets dangerous isn't in the intent, it's in the receipt. When the founder takes that advice and says that must be gospel, it must be universal, that breaks every time.
Let's push that a little further. I'm going to just lay it out there, put one right between the eyes for founders. What can get even worse is when a founder turns around and blames that investor or the advisor. They come in hot and they say, you gave me this advice and et cetera. And now nobody's investing in all those things. And part of me, obviously, there's a personal emotion involved. I get it.
Of course.
But the other part of me thinks to myself, if you're going to come at me like this and blame everybody else, and you've got this external locus of control where it's all about what everybody else is telling you, then you're not going to be a founder that anybody wants to invest in anyway.
Right. 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 Every time I talk to an investor and they talk about a founder that I just introduced them to, the same term always comes up. And for founders that have never heard this, this is important. It's, are they coachable? Are they coachable? Right. And what that actually means, if we really distill down to the bullet points, when they say the word coachable, the first thing they're saying is, do they have a sense of humility? Right. Because nothing is more annoying than investing in somebody that is just so goddamn arrogant that they're almost impossible to talk to. Some people say, well, they show confidence. There's a huge difference between confidence and arrogance. Arrogance is when it's painful to talk to you, right? That's arrogance, right? Confidence is where you're actively listening. You feel good about your opinion, but you're also listening. Arrogance is when you just shut the ears off altogether. The second thing that they talk about is when they're saying coachable, what they're really saying is, they'll do what I want them to do, right? I've never heard someone say, oh, that founder's super coachable, but they don't do a damn thing that I say. I'll give you an example of that. I was an incredibly coachable founder, even though I wanted to be a coachable founder. And I went through this entire process with an investor named Marc Suster. Marc runs Upfront Ventures. And Marc and I met right at the beginning of his venture career, I think right before he even joined that firm. And he had just come off of one of his own exits. And Marc had invested in one of my companies with his personal money, even before he ever got a chance to run the firm. And Marc, to his credit, and I hope he never listens to this, but Marc, to his credit, was trying so hard to coach me. And I was so uncoachable. And at the same time, like he would call me on Sunday and be like, hey, Will, here's some things I think you should be paying attention to. And on the one hand, I thought it was so cool that he was calling me. And on the other hand, I'm like, who the hell is this guy? Right? Like I've done this numerous times, right? Like I should be coaching you. Right. Now again, that was my arrogance, right? That was my arrogance. But at the same time, like I'm a nice guy. Like I really did appreciate what he was saying.
Sure.
But holy cow, did it fall on deaf ears. And I'll never forget, Marc had to do an intervention with me, right? He invites me to, like, it was a breakfast or something like that. And I show up and all of our investors are at this breakfast, right? I'm like, okay, this can't be good, right? And they're just like, dude, you got to take it down a notch. And you know what? Like, if I look back on what that really was, that was a breaking point for them. That was a point where they were like, dude, this guy seems smart. They said as much, right? This guy seems smart, but holy shit, he won't listen to anything, right? And they weren't wrong. To be fair, Ed, they weren't wrong. But when we talk about coachable, what they specifically mean is we never have to get to that point. We have to stage an intervention just to get this guy to listen. And frankly, they didn't need to do it twice. Once they did it, I got the hint. And in retrospect, I appreciated the fact they did it.
It's funny. I have the opposite story. I'm the type of person who becomes way too compliant with investors.
Right.
And this happened to me in China. So the general partner sat me down and he looked me in the eye and said, Ed, you need to give us feedback. Yeah. You need to tell us when we tell you something. You can't just say, okay, you have to explain it back to us. And they were very frustrated with me for the opposite reason.
Yep.
And I remember we're eating Chinese food. Obviously, we're in China. It was a nice restaurant. And I remember just sitting there going, wait a second. I thought I was making them all happy, doing what they told me to do. And I'm coachable. I'm totally open. But they were so frustrated with me because I didn't seem to have any conviction. I had no spine because I was just trying to do what they told me.
It's funny. I was thinking about that in terms of, I did this kind of mea culpa afterward, right, Ed? Where we were about to raise another round, and at first it was going so incredibly well. So my ability to listen was just a zero. And again, I also had never raised money before, so all of this was new. Like working with outside people, this was like my second or third company, or third or fourth company and I had never had outside investors, so this was just new to me. I was used to running my own show. And I was learning on the job, sadly. But I remember sitting down with a partner at Bessemer who was in our deal. And at this point, our next round of funding, our Series A, went from incredible to awful, like overnight. And I remember talking to him, and I was like, "Listen, man, I'm all ears. I'd love to hear, what I should be doing here." And he's like, "I don't believe you." And I'll never forget him saying, he was such a nice guy, right? He was like, "I don't believe you," and I'm like, "Wait, what?" He said, "Well, I honestly don't think you're listening." right?
Wow.
Yeah, no, I was like, man, tough love, but it was the right thing to say. Again, you got to understand from my standpoint, even if I don't agree with somebody, I can also respect their ability to have that opinion in what they're trying to say. Sometimes it might take me a minute to process it, but I do process it. Right? Like, and I remember when he said that, I was like, that was a moment where I was like, shit, I need to basically take a step back and evaluate how I'm listening. And he did me a huge favor.
I think that's a testament also to you as a founder, Will, as I look back. Obviously, hindsight's 2020, but the right investor will know whether or not to take that shot. And the fact that he sat you down and confronted you was actually a very kind thing, saying, I believe in your potential enough that I'm going to take this risk and go out of my way to put one right there.
Yep.
Or
And and to be fair, I was the equivalent of a bratty kid. I was a 32-year-old bratty kid, right? I had a ton of success before that, and I just had never been in this position where I had to quote listen to someone else. And that's not because I was an arrogant jerk. I just hadn't had that experience yet, right? And it was humbling as hell, and it was important. It was an important growth milestone.
I think we summarize this by saying, when it comes to investors being coachable, Goldilocks and the three bears. Not too hot, not too cold, just right.
Yep, exactly.